My name is Sarah Mitchell, and 3 months ago I held my dying mother's hand as she whispered her final words to me. I'm sorry, sweetheart, but everything goes to your sister. She needs it more than you do. Those words shattered something inside me that I didn't even know could break. After 26 years of being the responsible daughter, the one who stayed close to home, who became a nurse because I wanted to help people, who visited every Sunday without fail, I was hearing that none of it mattered. Before we jump back into this story, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My sister Jenny, who lived 3 states away and called maybe once a month, was getting everything. But here's the thing about deathbed confessions. Sometimes they're not confessions at all. Sometimes they're the last lie told by someone who's been protecting a secret so big it could change everything you thought you knew about your family. What I discovered 2 weeks after Mom's funeral made me realize that her final words weren't an apology, they were a warning. And what our family lawyer found hidden in Mom's craft room didn't just change my inheritance, it changed how I saw my entire childhood. The first thing you need to understand about my family is that we were perfectly ordinary in every way that mattered, and perfectly unfair in every way that hurt. Growing up in Riverside, California, in a modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Street, my sister Jenny and I shared a childhood that looked normal from the outside but felt lopsided from the inside. Our house was the kind of place where Mom's elementary school teaching salary and Dad's mechanic wages meant we had everything we needed but nothing extra, where family vacations were camping trips to the local state park, and new clothes came mostly at the start of the school year. Jenny was 3 years older than me, and from the moment I was old enough to understand family dynamics, I knew she was the sun around which our household revolved. She was beautiful in that effortless way that some people are blessed with thick auburn hair that caught the light and green eyes that sparkled when she laughed. More than that, she was smart, funny, and had this magnetic personality that drew people to her like moths to a flame. Teachers loved her, classmates wanted to be her friend, and our parents practically glowed with pride whenever they talked about her. Mom would light up whenever Jenny's name came up in conversation. At parent-teacher conferences, Jenny's teachers would rave about her creativity, her leadership skills, her potential. At family dinners, the conversation would inevitably turn to Jenny's latest achievement, her newest friend, her plans for the future. Even when Jenny wasn't physically present, she dominated our family's emotional landscape in a way that felt both natural and suffocating. I, on the other hand, was the practical daughter. Where Jenny was creative and spontaneous, I was steady and reliable. Where she dreamed big and talked about traveling the world and starting her own marketing company, I wanted to be a nurse because I liked taking care of people, and it seemed like steady, honest work. Where Jenny would breeze into the house full of stories about her adventures, I would come home from school, do my homework at the kitchen table, and help Mom with dinner without being asked. The difference in how we were treated wasn't dramatic enough to be called abuse, but it was consistent enough to shape who I became. When Jenny wanted to take art classes, Mom found a way to pay for them. When I expressed interest in joining the school's science club, I was told we needed to save money for Jenny's college applications. When Jenny got her driver's license, Dad helped her buy a used Honda Civic with money they'd been saving. When my turn came 2 years later, I was told I could use Mom's car when she didn't need it for work, which meant I usually walked or took the bus. It wasn't that my parents didn't love me. I knew they did, in their own way. But love and attention are different things, and attention was something Jenny received in abundance, while I learned to make do with scraps. Mom would brag to her friends about Jenny's acceptance to UC San Diego, about her internships, about her job offers. When I graduated from nursing school and got my first job at Riverside General, Mom mentioned it to her book club almost as an afterthought, like it was a nice but unremarkable achievement. The pattern continued into our adult lives. Jenny moved to Seattle after college, got married to a successful software engineer named Brad, and started her own boutique marketing firm that specialized in helping local businesses develop their brand identity. She lived in a beautiful house in a trendy neighborhood, traveled frequently for both work and pleasure, and had what everyone agreed was a very sophisticated lifestyle. Her social media was full of pictures from wine tastings, weekend trips to Portland, dinner parties with interesting-looking friends. Meanwhile, I stayed in Riverside. I rented a small apartment about 10 minutes from the house where I grew up, worked rotating shifts at the hospital, and spent my free time reading, hiking in the nearby hills, or visiting my parents. My life wasn't glamorous, but it was fulfilling in ways that were harder to photograph and post online. I loved my work, even when it was exhausting. There's something deeply satisfying about helping people through some of the worst moments of their lives, about being the steady presence when everything else feels chaotic and uncertain. My relationship with Michael Torres, a fellow nurse who worked in the emergency department, was the kind of quiet, steady love that builds over time, rather than exploding into existence. We'd known each other for 2 years before we started dating, and even then it felt more like a natural evolution than a dramatic romance. Michael understood the demands of healthcare work, the emotional toll of losing patients, the satisfaction of saving lives. He also understood why I felt obligated to visit my parents every Sunday, why I was always the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, why I couldn't seem to put myself first, even when logic suggested I should. Those Sunday visits became the anchor of my weekly routine. I would drive the familiar route from my apartment to Maple Street, usually stopping at the grocery store to pick up something I knew Mom needed or wanted. We would have lunch together, and I would help with whatever household projects Dad had been putting off, or I would sit with Mom while she worked on one of her endless craft projects, listening to her talk about her students, her book club, the neighbors, anything except the growing tension I could feel building in our family but couldn't quite name. Jenny's visits were different. She would fly in maybe 3 times a year, always with fanfare, always with gifts, always with stories that made our quiet riverside lives seem small and provincial by comparison. During these visits, Mom would cook elaborate meals, Dad would take time off work, and the whole house would buzz with an energy that felt both wonderful and somehow accusatory. Wonderful, because Jenny's presence reminded us all of how much fun we could have together as a family. Accusatory because preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, because her absence highlighted how routine and mundane our regular lives had become. The visits always followed the same pattern. The first day would be pure joy, with everyone catching up and marveling at how successful and sophisticated Jenny had become. The second day would involve family activities, usually something special that we rarely did when it was just the 3 of us. The third day would bring a subtle shift in mood, as the reality of Jenny's impending departure settled over the house like a cloud. And then she would be gone, leaving behind a void that felt disproportionate to the amount of time she'd actually been there. After these visits, Mom would spend weeks talking about Jenny's latest achievements, her beautiful house, her interesting friends, her exciting travel plans. It wasn't that she was trying to make me feel bad about my own life, but the contrast was impossible to ignore. I was the daughter who was always there, always available, always willing to help, but I was also the daughter whose presence was taken for granted in a way that Jenny's never was. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came on a Tuesday in early March. I had stopped by after work to drop off some prescription medications that Mom had asked me to pick up from the pharmacy. When I walked into the kitchen, I found her sitting at the table, staring blankly at a cup of tea that had obviously gone cold hours earlier. Her face was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes that I recognized from my years of working with patients who weren't sleeping well. "Mom, are you okay?" I asked, setting the pharmacy bag on the counter and moving to sit across from her at the table. She looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before, something that looked almost like guilt mixed with exhaustion. "Oh, Sarah, I didn't hear you come in. I knocked, but you didn't answer." The door was unlocked. I reached across the table to touch her hand, which felt cold and slightly clammy. "Have you been feeling sick?" "Just tired," she said, but her voice lacked its usual warmth. "I haven't been sleeping well lately. Is something bothering you? Is Dad okay?" She pulled her hand away from mine and wrapped both hands around her cold teacup. "Your father is fine. He's at the garage, working on Mrs. Peterson's car." "Then what's wrong?" For a moment I thought she might actually tell me. Her mouth opened slightly, and I saw her take a breath as if she was preparing to speak, but then she shook her head and stood up, carrying her untouched tea to the sink. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart. I'm just getting older, and sometimes older people don't sleep as well as they used to." I knew she was lying. After years of working with patients and families in crisis, you develop an instinct for when someone is hiding something important. But I also knew that pushing wouldn't get me anywhere. not with Mom. She had always been private about anything that might be considered family business, and she had raised both Jenny and me to understand that some conversations were off limits. Over the next few weeks, I noticed other changes. Mom seemed distracted during our Sunday visits, often losing track of conversations or forgetting things she had just told me. She was losing weight, though she insisted her appetite was fine. Most concerning to me, she had stopped working on her craft projects, something she had never done in all the years I could remember. Her craft room, which had always been her sanctuary, sat untouched while she spent most of her time in the living room, watching television shows she didn't seem to actually be following. When I mentioned my concerns to Dad, he brushed them off with the same explanation Mom had given me. "She's just tired, Sarah. You know how hard she's worked all these years. Maybe she's finally ready to slow down a little." But I knew it was more than that. In my work at the hospital, I had seen too many families ignore warning signs because they were too frightening to acknowledge. I had held the hands of too many children and spouses who wished they had pushed harder, asked more questions, insisted on answers when their intuition told them something was wrong. Finally, in late April, I convinced Mom to see her doctor for a general checkup. Dr. Amanda Foster had been Mom's physician for over 15 years, and she knew Mom well enough to recognize that something had changed. After a thorough examination and several tests, Dr. Foster called me into her office for a private conversation that I had been dreading since I first noticed Mom's symptoms. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about your mother's test results," Dr. Foster said, her professional demeanor barely masking the compassion in her eyes. "We found some concerning abnormalities that require immediate further testing." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I had been preparing myself for this possibility. "What kind of abnormalities?" "There are several indicators that suggest we may be dealing with a serious illness. I've scheduled your mother for additional tests tomorrow, and I've referred her to an oncologist for consultation. Cancer." She didn't say the word, but we both knew what she was talking about. I felt the familiar sensation of the world tilting slightly, the way it does when you receive news that changes everything you thought you knew about your future. "How serious?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "We won't know for certain until we get the results of the additional tests, but I want you to be prepared for the possibility that we're looking at an advanced stage diagnosis." That night, I sat in my apartment trying to figure out how to tell Jenny what was happening. We talked maybe once every few weeks, usually brief conversations about work or family news. Nothing that prepared me for having to deliver potentially devastating medical information. Finally, I decided to call her directly, knowing that this wasn't the kind of news that could wait for a convenient time. "Sarah, is everything okay?" "You never call this late," Jenny said when she answered, and I could hear the immediate concern in her voice. "It's Mom," I said, and then found myself unable to continue for a moment. "She's been sick, and today we found out it might be something serious." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, Jenny spoke, her voice smaller than I had heard it since we were children. "How serious?" I told her everything Dr. Foster had shared with me, about the tests, the oncologist, the possibility that we were looking at an advanced diagnosis. Jenny listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for so long that I started to worry about her. "I'll fly down this weekend," she said finally. "I need to see her." "Jenny, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. She's my mother too, Sarah." The following Monday, the test results confirmed what Dr. Foster had suspected. Mom had pancreatic cancer, stage 4, with metastases that made treatment options extremely limited. The oncologist, a kind but straightforward woman named Dr. Patricia Huang, explained that we were looking at months rather than years, and that our focus should be on comfort and quality of life, rather than aggressive treatment that was unlikely to be effective. Mom took the news with a composure that surprised all of us. She listened carefully to Dr. Huang's explanation, asked practical questions about pain management and what to expect, and then nodded as if she had been given information about someone else's condition, rather than her own terminal diagnosis. "Well," she said when Dr. Huang left the room, "I suppose that explains why I've been feeling so tired." Jenny had been holding Mom's hand throughout the consultation, and I watched as she tightened her grip. Mom, we're gonna fight this. There have to be other options, other doctors, clinical trials. Sweetheart, Mom said gently, sometimes the most important fight is knowing when to stop fighting. Over the next 3 months, our family dynamic shifted in ways that were both beautiful and heartbreaking. Jenny took a leave of absence from her marketing firm and moved back to Riverside temporarily, staying in her old bedroom and helping with Mom's care. For the first time in years, we were all together regularly, and despite the circumstances, there were moments of genuine joy and connection that reminded me why I had always loved my family so much. Mom's condition deteriorated gradually but steadily. She lost more weight, tired more easily, and began needing help with tasks that had always been simple for her. But her mind remained sharp, and she seemed determined to use whatever time she had left to strengthen the bonds between all of us. She would ask Jenny and me to sit with her in the evenings, sharing stories about our childhoods, talking about our hopes and dreams, having conversations that we had somehow never made time for when we thought we had unlimited time ahead of us. It was during one of these evening conversations that Mom brought up the subject of her will. Jenny and I were sitting on either side of her bed, and she was holding both of our hands, something that had become a comforting ritual for all of us. I need to talk to you girls about practical matters, she said, her voice still strong despite the physical weakness that was becoming more apparent each day. I've updated my will, and I want you both to understand my decisions. Jenny and I exchanged glances. We had both been avoiding thinking about the financial implications of Mom's illness, partly because it felt wrong to focus on material concerns when we were losing her, and partly because neither of us knew what to expect. Mom, you don't need to worry about that right now, I said. Let's just focus on making sure you're comfortable. I do need to worry about it, she replied firmly. It's important to me that you both understand why I've made the choices I have. She explained that the house would go to Jenny, along with most of the savings and investments that she and Dad had accumulated over their marriage. I would receive some smaller items, personal belongings, and a modest amount of money, but the bulk of the estate would go to my sister. Jenny has always been more ambitious than you, Sarah, Mom said, squeezing my hand as if to soften the words. She has bigger dreams, more expensive goals. You've always been content with less, and I've always admired that about you. But Jenny needs more help to achieve the things she wants to accomplish. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I nodded and tried to keep my expression neutral. This wasn't entirely surprising, given the pattern of favoritism that had characterized our family for as long as I could remember. But hearing it stated so matter-of-factly, especially at such a vulnerable time, felt like a final confirmation of something I had always feared. That my practical, steady love had been valued less than Jenny's dramatic, absent affection. I understand, Mom, I said, because what else could I say? But Jenny looked uncomfortable with the explanation. Mom, that doesn't seem fair. Sarah has been here taking care of you, helping Dad, being the responsible one. She deserves. This isn't about deserving, Mom interrupted. This is about need and opportunity. Sarah has her nursing career, her steady income, her simple lifestyle. She'll be fine. You have business loans, a mortgage, employees depending on you. You need the help more. The conversation ended there, but it left me feeling unsettled in a way that I couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't the money itself that bothered me. I had never expected to inherit much, and I genuinely didn't need financial help. It was the reasoning behind the decision, the implication that my contentment with a simple life somehow made me less deserving of my parents' investment and support. As Mom's condition worsened over the summer, these conversations about the future became more frequent and more detailed. She would talk about her hopes for Jenny's business, her pride in my work as a nurse, her gratitude for the time we had all been able to spend together. But underneath the surface warmth, I continued to feel the sting of being considered the daughter who needed less, who expected less, who somehow mattered less in the grand scheme of our family's legacy. The end came in late August, on a Tuesday evening that started like many others. Mom had been having a difficult day, sleeping more than usual and eating very little. Jenny and I had both been with her throughout the afternoon, and Dad had come home from work early to sit with us. Around 7 o'clock, Mom asked if she could speak to me privately. Jenny and Dad stepped out of the room, and I moved my chair closer to Mom's bed. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. but her eyes were still bright and focused. "Sarah, I need to tell you something important," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is it, Mom?" She took my hand in both of hers, and I could feel how fragile her bones had become. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but everything goes to your sister. She needs it more than you do." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were surprising, but because they were so final. This was her deathbed confession, her last chance to explain or apologize or somehow make right the years of unequal treatment. And instead of offering comfort or expressing regret, she was doubling down on the decision that had hurt me most. "I know, Mom," I managed to say. "You already explained." "No, you don't understand," she said, gripping my hand tighter. "Everything goes to your sister. Everything. Promise me you won't fight it. Promise me you'll let her have what she needs." I stared at her, confused by the urgency in her voice. We had already discussed the will. Why was she bringing it up again now with such intensity? "I promise, Mom." She relaxed slightly but kept holding my hand. "You're going to be okay, Sarah. You're stronger than you know. You're going to be just fine." Those were the last coherent words she spoke to me. She died 3 hours later, with Jenny, Dad, and me all holding her hands, surrounded by the quiet sounds of the home where she had spent most of her adult life. The funeral was everything Mom would have wanted. Simple, dignified, well attended by the teachers, neighbors, and friends who had known and loved her. Jenny gave a beautiful eulogy that captured Mom's warmth, her dedication to her students, her love for her family. I spoke briefly about her strength and her kindness, though I found it difficult to find words that felt adequate to describe someone who had been such a central part of my world for 26 years. In the weeks following the funeral, Jenny and I began the process of settling Mom's estate. We met with Robert Chen, the family lawyer who had handled Mom's legal affairs for years, to review the will and begin the probate process. Mr. Chen was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had known our family since Jenny and I were teenagers, and he approached the meeting with the appropriate combination of professionalism and personal warmth. "I want to express my condolences again," he said, as we settled into chairs in his downtown office. "Your mother was a wonderful woman, and I know how much you girls meant to her." "Thank you, Mr. Chen," Jenny said. "We're ready to hear what we need to do to move forward." Mr. Chen opened a file folder and pulled out a document that I recognized as Mom's will. "The process is fairly straightforward. As your mother explained to you, the house and the majority of the liquid assets will go to Jennifer, with some smaller bequests and personal items going to Sarah. There's also a provision for your father to continue living in the house for as long as he chooses, with all expenses paid from the estate." He walked us through the details, explaining the timeline for probate, the tax implications, and the practical steps we would need to take to transfer ownership of various assets. Everything was exactly as Mom had described it to us, and I found myself feeling strangely relieved that there were no surprises, no additional hurt to process on top of everything else we were dealing with. "Do you have any questions about the will itself?" Mr. Chen asked. Jenny and I both shook our heads. It seemed straightforward enough, even if it wasn't exactly what I might have hoped for. "All right then," Mr. Chen said. "I'll need you both to sign some documents to begin the probate process, and then we can start moving forward." As we were gathering our things to leave, Mr. Chen mentioned that he would need to visit the house to review Mom's personal papers and make sure everything was in order for the estate settlement. "Your mother was very organized," he said with a slight smile. "But sometimes people keep important documents in unexpected places. I'll need to do a thorough review to make sure we haven't missed anything." Neither Jenny nor I thought much of this comment at the time. It seemed like standard legal procedure, the kind of thorough attention to detail that we would expect from a competent attorney handling our mother's affairs. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that we realized just how thorough Mr. Chen's review would need to be, and how many surprises our organized, predictable mother had been keeping from all of us. The thing about growing up as the less favored child is that you become an expert at reading the subtle signs of disappointment, the quiet sighs that follow your achievements, the way conversations shift when you enter a room. For 26 years, I had been fluent in this language of conditional love, and I had learned to translate every interaction through the lens of not being quite enough. Jenny's success had always been the family's main storyline, while my stability was relegated to a footnote. When she graduated valedictorian from high school, there was a celebration dinner at the nicest restaurant in Riverside, complete with a cake that Mom had special ordered from the bakery downtown. When I graduated 2 years later with honors and a full scholarship to the local community college's nursing program, we had pizza at home, and Mom mentioned my achievement briefly to Mrs. Rodriguez from next door while they were chatting over the fence. The pattern was so consistent that it became invisible, like wallpaper you stop noticing after living with it for years. Jenny's college graduation was a family vacation to San Diego, with Dad taking time off work and Mom buying a new dress for the ceremony. My nursing school graduation was attended by Mom alone, because Dad had to work and Jenny was busy launching her marketing business. Mom took a few photos with her phone, complimented my cap and gown, and drove me to lunch at Denny's afterward. When Jenny got engaged to Brad, a software engineer she had met through work, the announcement became the centerpiece of family conversation for months. Mom immediately began planning an engagement party, researching wedding venues, and collecting bridal magazines. She would call Jenny multiple times a week to discuss color schemes, guest lists, and catering options. The wedding itself was a beautiful affair in Seattle, with 150 guests, a professional photographer, and a reception at an upscale hotel overlooking Puget Sound. Mom and Dad flew up 3 days early to help with preparations, and Mom still kept the wedding album on the coffee table in the living room 5 years later. When Michael and I decided to move in together after dating for 18 months, I mentioned it to Mom during one of our Sunday visits. She nodded politely, asked if I was sure I was ready for that step, and then changed the subject to something Jenny had posted on social media about a wine tasting event in Portland. There was no excitement, no questions about our future plans, no offer to help with the move. It wasn't that she disapproved exactly, it was more like she couldn't summon the energy to be invested in my personal life the way she was invested in Jenny's. The financial disparity was perhaps the most telling aspect of the pattern. Throughout our childhoods, Jenny's needs and wants were treated as family priorities, while mine were subject to budget constraints that seemed to appear and disappear based on who was asking. When Jenny wanted to take a summer photography course in high school, Mom and Dad found the money by canceling their own vacation plans. When I wanted to attend a 3-day nursing conference that would have helped my career development, I was told it was too expensive and maybe I could find the information online instead. Jenny's car was purchased when she turned 17, a reliable used Honda that Dad spent weeks researching and negotiating to get the best deal. When I turned 17, I was told I could use Mom's old Toyota when she didn't need it, which meant I usually ended up walking or catching rides with friends. The car situation became a perfect metaphor for our family dynamic. Jenny had reliable transportation that was specifically hers, while I made do with whatever was available and tried not to inconvenience anyone by needing to go somewhere. College funding followed the same pattern. Jenny's education was treated as an investment in the family's future, with Mom and Dad contributing everything they could afford and encouraging her to focus on her studies rather than working part-time. My education was framed as a personal responsibility, something I should be grateful to pursue, but not something the family should sacrifice for. I worked 20 hours a week throughout nursing school, not because we desperately needed the money, but because it was understood that Jenny's needs took priority and my needs were secondary. The emotional labor in our household was also divided along these invisible lines. I was the daughter who was expected to remember birthdays, send thank you cards, call elderly relatives, and organize family gatherings. Jenny was excused from these responsibilities because she was busy with more important things, pursuing her career and building her life in Seattle. I became the family's emotional caretaker by default, the one who noticed when Mom seemed stressed, who helped Dad with household projects, who maintained the connections that kept our extended family feeling like a family. When Jenny did visit, which happened 3 or 4 times a year, the entire household would reorganize itself around her presence. Mom would spend days preparing, cleaning the house more thoroughly than usual, planning special meals, and making sure Jenny's old bedroom was perfect. Dad would take time off work to spend with her, something he rarely did for ordinary family occasions. I would rearrange my schedule to be available, knowing that my regular routine was less important than maximizing our time with Jenny. During these visits, Jenny would hold court in the living room, sharing stories about her work, her travels, her social life in Seattle. She had a gift for making even mundane experiences sound exciting and sophisticated. A regular dinner at a new restaurant became an adventure in culinary exploration. A weekend trip to Portland became a cultural expedition, filled with art galleries and craft breweries. A work conference became an opportunity to network with fascinating people and learn about cutting-edge marketing strategies. Mom and Dad would listen to these stories with the kind of rapt attention that I had learned not to expect when I talked about my own life. My stories about difficult patients, successful treatments, or challenging cases at the hospital were met with polite interest, but Jenny's stories about client presentations and creative campaigns were met with genuine excitement and endless follow-up questions. The visits always followed a predictable emotional arc. The first day would be pure celebration, with everyone thrilled to be together and Jenny regaling us with updates from her glamorous life. The second day would involve family activities, usually something special that we rarely did when it was just the three of us dining out, going to a movie, visiting a local attraction that we normally took for granted. The third day would be tinged with sadness as Jenny's departure approached, and Mom would become increasingly quiet and withdrawn. After Jenny left, there would be a period of emotional deflation that could last for weeks. Mom would talk constantly about the visit, replaying conversations, and sharing photos that Jenny had posted on social media. She would mention how proud she was of Jenny's accomplishments, how impressed she was with Jenny's sophisticated lifestyle, how grateful she was that Jenny had taken time from her busy schedule to visit us. The subtext was always clear. Jenny's life was exciting and important, while our regular routine was mundane and forgettable. During these post-visit periods, I would find myself working harder to engage Mom in conversation, to interest her in my own life, to somehow fill the void that Jenny's absence had created. But it was like trying to compete with a movie by telling stories about real life. Jenny's visits were performance pieces, carefully curated presentations of success and sophistication, while my presence was just the ordinary backdrop against which these performances took place. The most painful part of this dynamic wasn't the obvious favoritism, though that certainly hurt. It was the way my own accomplishments were consistently reframed to highlight Jenny's superiority. When I received a commendation at work for my patient care, Mom's response was to mention how proud she was that both her daughters were excelling in their chosen fields, but then spend 10 minutes talking about Jenny's latest marketing award. When I was promoted to a senior nursing position, Mom congratulated me and immediately wondered aloud whether Jenny might be interested in expanding her business to include healthcare marketing. I learned to anticipate these conversational pivots, the way discussions of my life would somehow circle back to Jenny's greater achievements. It became easier to share less, to keep my successes and struggles to myself, rather than watch them be diminished by comparison to my sister's more impressive trajectory. I developed a protective instinct that kept me from investing too much emotional energy in seeking my parents' approval, because I had learned that their approval was conditional and limited. The irony was that Jenny seemed largely unaware of this family dynamic, or at least unaware of its impact on me. During her visits, she would ask about my work with genuine interest and compliment me on my dedication to helping people. She would thank me for taking care of Mom and Dad, acknowledging that her distance made it impossible for her to contribute in the same way. She never seemed to realize that her casual gratitude highlighted the very inequality that defined our family relationships. Part 3. The Normal World Asterisk. By the time I reached my mid-20s, I had built a life that felt authentic and meaningful, even if it wasn't the life that my family found most impressive. My work as a nurse at Riverside General gave me a sense of purpose that went beyond career advancement or financial success. Every shift brought new challenges, new opportunities to make a real difference in people's lives during some of their most vulnerable moments. The hospital had become my second home, a place where my skills and dedication were recognized and valued. My colleagues respected my clinical judgment, patients trusted my care, and supervisors relied on my steady presence during difficult cases. In this environment, I wasn't the less impressive daughter or the practical sibling who settled for less. I was simply Sarah, a competent professional who could be counted on to show up and do the work that needed to be done. My relationship with Michael had evolved into something steady and supportive, built on shared values and mutual respect rather than grand romantic gestures or dramatic declarations. We understood each other's work schedules, supported each other through difficult cases, and enjoyed the simple pleasures of quiet evenings at home after long shifts. Our relationship wasn't the kind that generated exciting stories for family dinners, but it was the kind that provided a foundation for building a real life together. Michael had grown up in a large, boisterous family, where attention was distributed more evenly among siblings, and he sometimes struggled to understand my family's dynamics. He would listen patiently when I described the subtle ways that Jenny's achievements overshadowed my own, but I could tell that he found it difficult to relate to the experience of being consistently undervalued by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. Have you ever talked to your parents about how this makes you feel? He asked one evening as we sat on his apartment balcony, sharing a bottle of wine after a particularly challenging week at work. What would be the point? I replied, watching the sun set over the hills that surrounded Riverside. They're not doing it intentionally. They just see Jenny and me differently, and they've always seen us differently. I can't change that by talking about it. But maybe they don't realize how it affects you, Michael suggested. Maybe if they understood... They understand enough, I said, cutting him off more sharply than I intended. They understand that Jenny is the daughter who exceeded their expectations, and I'm the daughter who met their expectations. That's not something you fix with a conversation. Michael had learned not to push these discussions too far, recognizing that my family relationships were more complicated than they appeared on the surface. But I could see the concern in his eyes, the way he worried that I was accepting less than I deserved in all areas of my life because I had been trained to expect less from the people who mattered most. My Sunday visits with Mom and Dad had become routine in a way that felt both comforting and slightly depressing. I would arrive around noon, usually stopping to pick up groceries or run errands that they needed help with. Mom would have lunch ready, something simple but thoughtful, and we would eat together while Dad talked about his work at the garage, and Mom shared news about the neighborhood, her book club, or her former teaching colleagues who were now retired. After lunch, I would help with whatever household projects needed attention. Dad was getting older and finding it harder to manage the physical demands of home maintenance, though he was too proud to admit it directly. I became skilled at identifying tasks that needed to be done, and offering to help in ways that didn't make him feel diminished. I would suggest that I needed the practice changing light fixtures, or that I was curious about how to fix a leaky faucet, and he would teach me while I did the actual work. Mom would usually spend this time working on one of her craft projects, which had evolved over the years from simple knitting and embroidery to more complex quilting and woodworking projects. Her craft room had become her sanctuary, a space filled with supplies, tools, and half-finished projects that represented her creative outlet during retirement. She would work while we talked, her hands busy with detailed work, while her mind wandered through family news, neighborhood gossip, and memories from her teaching career. These Sunday visits were pleasant enough, but they also highlighted the routine nature of my relationship with my parents compared to the special occasion quality of Jenny's visits. My presence was expected and appreciated, but it wasn't celebrated. I was part of the regular fabric of their lives, which meant I was taken for granted in ways that Jenny, with her dramatic entrances and exits, never was. The conversations during these visits rarely ventured into deeply personal territory. We talked about work, weather, current events, and family news, but we didn't discuss hopes, fears, dreams, or disappointments. I had learned over the years that my parents weren't comfortable with emotional intimacy, preferring to express their love through practical actions rather than heartfelt conversations. They showed they cared by making sure I had enough to eat, by remembering to ask about my work schedule, by worrying when I drove home late at night. This emotional distance had shaped my own communication style, making me more comfortable with surface-level pleasantries than with vulnerable honesty. I had become skilled at sharing information about my life without revealing how I felt about that life, at participating in family conversations without exposing my deeper needs for recognition and validation. It was a protective strategy that kept me from being hurt by their lack of interest, but it also kept me from experiencing the kind of authentic connection I craved. The most significant change in this routine came when Mom began showing signs of illness, though none of us recognized the symptoms for what they were initially. She seemed more tired than usual, less interested in her craft projects, more easily distracted during conversations. Dad and I both attributed these changes to the natural process of aging, the way people slow down as they move through their 70s. It wasn't until the symptoms became more pronounced that I began to worry seriously about Mom's health. My training as a nurse had taught me to recognize the signs of serious illness, and I was seeing too many red flags to ignore. The weight loss, the fatigue, the subtle changes in her cognitive function that suggested something more significant than normal aging. The period between noticing these symptoms and getting a definitive diagnosis was filled with the kind of anticipatory grief that healthcare workers know too well. I found myself studying Mom more carefully during our visits, cataloging changes and trying to assess how much time we might have left together. The possibility of losing her forced me to confront how much our relationship meant to me, despite its limitations and frustrations. During this time, I also found myself thinking more about Jenny and the complex emotions I felt toward my sister. Part of me resented her absence during Mom's illness, the way she was able to maintain her busy life in Seattle, while I dealt with the daily reality of managing a parent's declining health. But another part of me felt protective of her, knowing that she would be devastated by the loss of Mom and wanting to shield her from the gradual deterioration I was witnessing. When we finally received Mom's diagnosis, it clarified many things while making others more complicated. The terminal nature of her cancer meant that our time together was limited, which gave every interaction additional weight and significance. But it also meant that the family dynamics I had spent years learning to navigate were about to change fundamentally, in ways none of us could fully prepare for. Part 4. Living in the Shadow. The months following Mom's diagnosis brought our family closer together physically than we had been in years, but they also intensified the emotional patterns that had defined our relationships throughout my childhood. Jenny's temporary return to Riverside meant that for the first time since college, we were all living under the same roof again, trying to navigate the complex dynamics of adult siblings caring for a dying parent. Jenny approached Mom's illness with the same organized intensity she brought to her business ventures. She researched treatment options, created schedules for medication and doctor's appointments, and transformed Mom's bedroom into what she called a healing environment, with special lighting, aromatherapy diffusers, and carefully curated music playlists. Her efforts were well-intentioned and genuinely helpful, but they also carried an implicit message that managing Mom's care required the kind of strategic thinking and professional competence that Jenny possessed and I somehow lacked. I found myself in the awkward position of being both the most knowledgeable about healthcare and the least consulted about important decisions. My years of nursing experience meant I understood Mom's condition, treatment options, and prognosis better than anyone else in the family. But Jenny's assertive personality and my own tendency to avoid conflict meant that she often took the lead in conversations with doctors and other medical professionals. During medical appointments, Jenny would arrive with typed lists of questions, research printouts, and detailed notes about Mom's symptoms and responses to treatment. She presented herself as the primary caregiver and decision-maker, while I sat quietly in the background, occasionally offering technical clarifications or professional insights when asked directly. The doctors and nurses naturally responded to Jenny's organized approach and apparent expertise, not realizing that I was the one with actual medical training and daily caregiving experience. This dynamic was particularly frustrating, because I could see that some of Jenny's research had led her to unrealistic expectations about treatment options and outcomes. She had found stories of miraculous recoveries, experimental treatments, and alternative therapies that gave her hope, but weren't realistic options for Mom's specific situation. As a healthcare professional, I knew that these false hopes could make the dying process more difficult for everyone involved. But I struggled to find a way to share this knowledge without seeming negative or unsupportive. Mom seemed to enjoy having both daughters focused on her care, but she also responded differently to each of us in ways that reflected our lifelong family roles. With Jenny, she was more animated and engaged, discussing future plans and treatment possibilities with an optimism that seemed designed to protect Jenny from the reality of her situation. With me, she was more practical and resigned, acknowledging the limitations of her condition and focusing on immediate comfort rather than long-term hope. These different conversational styles meant that Jenny and I were receiving different messages about Mom's condition and prognosis, which led to tension between us about the best approach to her care. Jenny wanted to pursue every possible treatment option and maintain hope for recovery, while I knew from both professional experience and Mom's own private admissions that we should be focusing on palliative care and quality of life issues. Dad found himself caught between his daughter's different approaches to Mom's illness, trying to support both of us while managing his own grief and fear about losing his partner of 38 years. He had always been more comfortable with practical problems than emotional ones, and the complex feelings surrounding Mom's terminal diagnoses left him feeling helpless and overwhelmed. The household routine during these months revolved around Mom's needs and schedule, but it also highlighted the different ways that Jenny and I contributed to family life. Jenny excelled at the dramatic gestures and special occasions. She arranged for Mom's favorite flowers to be delivered weekly, organized visits from old friends and colleagues, and planned elaborate meals that Mom mostly couldn't eat, but appreciated nonetheless. I handled the daily maintenance tasks that kept Mom comfortable but weren't particularly visible or noteworthy. Managing her medications, helping with personal care, doing laundry, maintaining the household supplies that everyone else took for granted. My contributions were necessary but mundane, while Jenny's were memorable and emotionally significant. This division of labor reflected our lifelong family roles, but it became more pronounced under the stress of caring for a dying parent. Jenny was the daughter who provided inspiration and hope, while I was the daughter who provided stability and practical support. Both roles were valuable, but only one was celebrated and appreciated in ways that felt meaningful. The most difficult aspect of this period was watching Mom and Jenny reconnect in ways that highlighted everything I had always wanted from my relationship with my mother. They would spend hours talking about Jenny's business, her marriage, her hopes for the future, and her memories of growing up in our family. These conversations were intimate and emotional in ways that my interactions with Mom had never been, and I found myself feeling jealous of the connection they were building, even as I was grateful that Mom was experiencing these moments of joy and closeness. Jenny seemed genuinely surprised by the intensity of Mom's interest in her life and achievements. She had always taken Mom's attention for granted, not realizing that the admiration and pride she received so easily were things I had spent years hoping to earn. Watching them together forced me to confront the depth of my own longing for maternal approval, and the ways I had learned to suppress that longing in order to protect myself from disappointment. During the evenings when the three of us would sit together in Mom's bedroom, I often felt like an observer, rather than a participant in our family's final chapter. Mom and Jenny would engage in animated discussions about people, places, and experiences that I knew about but hadn't shared, while I sat quietly, offering occasional comments but mostly just witnessing their connection. These moments were beautiful and heartbreaking simultaneously. I was genuinely happy to see Mom so engaged and peaceful, enjoying these deep conversations with the daughter she had always been most proud of. But I was also acutely aware that I would never have this kind of relationship with her, that the patterns established over 26 years weren't going to change in her final months, no matter how much I might wish they could. The realization that I was losing not just my mother but also my last chance to earn the kind of maternal approval and attention that Jenny had always received naturally, added another layer of grief to an already devastating situation. I was mourning Mom's impending death, but I was also mourning the relationship we had never had and would never have the opportunity to develop. Part 5: The Triggering Event. The conversation that would eventually unravel everything I thought I knew about my family happened on a humid Tuesday evening in late August, 3 days before Mom died. Jenny had driven to the pharmacy to pick up pain medication, and Dad was working late at the garage, finishing a repair job that couldn't wait until morning. I was alone with Mom for the first time in weeks, sitting beside her bed in the dim light of her bedside lamp, listening to the quiet sounds of her increasingly labored breathing. Mom had been drifting in and out of consciousness throughout the day, and the hospice nurse had warned us that her time was becoming very short. But during this particular evening, she seemed more alert than she had been in days, her eyes clear and focused when she looked at me. "Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but surprisingly steady. "I need to tell you something important." I leaned closer to her bed, taking her hand in mine. Her skin felt paper-thin and cold, but her grip was surprisingly firm. "What is it, Mom?" She looked directly into my eyes with an intensity that I hadn't seen from her in months. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but everything goes to your sister. She needs it more than you do." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because of the way she said them. There was an urgency in her voice that seemed disproportionate to the message itself. We had already discussed the will, already established that Jenny would inherit the bulk of the estate. Why was she bringing this up again now, with such desperate emphasis? I know, Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring. You already explained about the will. I understand. But she shook her head vigorously, her grip on my hand tightening painfully. No, you don't understand. Everything goes to your sister. Everything. You have to promise me you won't fight it. Promise me you'll let her have what she needs. I stared at her, completely confused by the panic I could hear in her voice. This wasn't the calm, matter-of-fact discussion about inheritance that we had had several times over the previous months. This was something else entirely, something that seemed to frighten her in ways I couldn't comprehend. Mom, I already promised I wouldn't fight the will. I'm not going to cause problems for Jenny. No, she said again, more forcefully this time. You don't understand what I'm telling you. Everything goes to your sister. The house, the money, all of it. You get nothing. Nothing at all. The word nothing hung in the air between us like a challenge. This was different from what she had told me before. Different from the will that Mr. Chen had described. In our previous conversations, she had said that Jenny would get the house and most of the assets, but that I would receive some personal items and a small amount of money. Now she was saying I would get nothing at all. Mom, that's not what you told me before. You said? I know what I said before, she interrupted, her voice becoming agitated. But that's not what's going to happen. Everything goes to Jenny. She needs it all. You're strong, Sarah. You'll be fine on your own. But Jenny needs help, and she's going to get everything. I felt something cold and heavy settle in my stomach. There was something wrong about this conversation, something that went beyond the obvious unfairness of the inheritance she was describing. Mom's eyes held a look that I had never seen before. A combination of guilt, fear, and desperate pleading that made me wonder if her medications were affecting her judgment. Mom, are you feeling okay? Should I call the nurse? I'm fine, she said, though her breathing was becoming more rapid and shallow. I just need you to promise me. Promise me you won't fight it. Promise me you'll let Jenny have everything she needs. I promise, I said, because I could see that my agreement was the only thing that would calm her down. I won't fight it, Mom. She relaxed slightly at my words but continued to hold my hand with surprising strength. You're going to be okay, Sarah. You're stronger than you know. You've always been the strong one. You're going to be just fine. Those words felt like both a compliment and a dismissal, an acknowledgement of my resilience, coupled with an expectation that I would need less support because I was capable of providing it for myself. It was the same message I had been receiving from my family my entire life. I was valued for my strength and self-sufficiency, but those same qualities were used to justify giving me less attention, support, and resources. I love you, Mom, I said, not knowing what else to say. I love you too, sweetheart, she replied, her voice growing weaker. More than you know. Jenny returned from the pharmacy about 20 minutes later, and Mom had already fallen back into the semi-conscious state that had become her normal condition. I didn't mention our conversation to Jenny, partly because I wasn't sure how to explain it, and partly because I was still processing what Mom had said and why she had seemed so desperate for my agreement. Over the next 3 days, as Mom's condition continued to deteriorate, I found myself replaying that conversation and trying to understand what had triggered such urgency in her voice. The inheritance arrangement she had described was certainly unfair, but it wasn't dramatically different from what we had already discussed. Why had she seemed so frightened that I might fight it? What was she so worried that I might discover or contest? The questions multiplied when Mom died on Friday evening, surrounded by her family but having said very little during her final hours. Her last coherent words had been spoken to me on Tuesday night, and they had been focused entirely on making sure that Jenny received everything, and that I accepted getting nothing. During the funeral and the immediate aftermath, I pushed these concerns to the back of my mind, focusing instead on the practical and emotional demands of saying goodbye to the woman who had been the center of our family for as long as I could remember. But the questions remained, lurking beneath the surface of my grief and confusion about what came next. It wasn't until we met with Mr. Chen to begin the probate process that I started to understand why Mom had been so insistent about my acceptance of the inheritance arrangement. The will he presented to us was exactly as she had described it in our final conversation. Jenny would receive everything: the house, the investments, the savings accounts, all of it. I would receive nothing but a few personal items of minimal value. This was dramatically different from what Mom had told Jenny and me during our earlier conversations. When she had described a more equitable distribution that gave Jenny the majority of assets, but provided me with some financial security as well. The will that Mr. Chen read to us was harsh in its completeness, leaving no doubt that I was considered undeserving of any meaningful inheritance from my parents' life work. Jenny looked as shocked as I felt when Mr. Chen finished reading the will. She had clearly expected to inherit more than I would, but she hadn't expected me to be completely disinherited. The expression on her face suggested that she was as confused by this development as I was, which made me wonder whether Mom had given us different information about her intentions. "Is this the most recent version of the will?" Jenny asked Mr. Chen, her voice carefully controlled. "This will was executed 6 months ago," he replied, "shortly after your mother's diagnosis." She was very specific about these provisions and asked me several times to confirm that they were clearly stated. 6 months ago. That meant Mom had created this will after she knew she was dying, and after our family had come back together to care for her. She had spent months watching Jenny and me work together to support her through her illness, and her response had been to cut me out of her estate entirely. As we left Mr. Chen's office that afternoon, I felt numb rather than angry. The financial loss was significant, but it wasn't devastating. I had my own career, my own savings, and my own ability to take care of myself. What hurt was the message the will sent about my worth to my family, the final confirmation that all my years of steady support and reliable presence had been less valuable than Jenny's occasional visits and dramatic gestures. But there was still something about Mom's desperate urgency during our final conversation that didn't make sense. If the will accurately reflected her wishes, why had she seemed so worried that I might fight it? What had she been afraid I might discover that would make me want to contest her decisions? These questions would continue to puzzle me for the next 2 weeks, until Mr. Chen made a discovery in Mom's craft room that would change everything I thought I knew about my mother, my family, and the real reason why everything was supposed to go to my sister. The days following our meeting with Mr. Chen passed in a haze of funeral arrangements, condolence visits, and the strange emptiness that settles over a house after someone dies. Dad moved through these routines like a man underwater, going through the motions of daily life, while clearly struggling to process the reality of losing his partner of nearly 4 decades. Jenny threw herself into organizing Mom's affairs with characteristic efficiency, making lists of tasks, coordinating with funeral directors, and managing the stream of neighbors and friends who stopped by with casseroles and sympathy. I found myself caught between wanting to help with these practical matters and needing space to process my own complicated grief. The inheritance situation had added a layer of hurt and confusion to my mourning that I wasn't sure how to navigate. Every time I looked around the house where I had grown up, I was reminded that none of it would be mine, that my connection to this place and these memories would end when Jenny decided to sell or renovate. But more than the financial disappointment, I was haunted by the memory of Mom's desperate urgency during our final conversation. The more I replayed her words, the more convinced I became that there was something she hadn't told me, something that explained why she had been so frantic about ensuring my compliance with her wishes. 3 days after the funeral, I was helping Jenny sort through Mom's clothing when I mentioned the conversation that had been troubling me. "Mom seemed really worried about something during our last talk," I said, carefully folding one of Mom's cardigans into a donation box. "She kept asking me to promise I wouldn't fight the will, like she was afraid I might discover something that would change my mind." Jenny looked up from the jewelry box she was examining, her expression thoughtful. "That's strange. When she talked to me about the inheritance, she seemed very calm and matter-of-fact about it. She said she had made her decision based on our different needs and circumstances." "Different needs," I repeated, feeling a familiar sting of resentment. "Right. Because I need less, so I should get less." "Sarah, that's not what I mean," Jenny said quickly. "I know this whole situation is unfair, and I've been thinking about ways to make it more equitable once everything is settled." "That's not the point," I replied. though I appreciated her gesture. I'm not worried about the money. I'm worried about why Mom was so scared that I might contest her decision. What did she think I might find out? Jenny was quiet for a moment, turning Mom's pearl earrings over in her palm. Maybe she was just worried about family conflict. You know how she hated any kind of confrontation or drama. Maybe, I said, but I wasn't convinced. Mom's fear had seemed too specific, too focused on the possibility that I might discover something rather than simply object to something. That evening, after Jenny had returned to the hotel where she was staying until she could figure out longer-term housing arrangements, I found myself alone in the house with Dad for the first time since Mom's death. He was sitting in his recliner, staring at the evening news without really watching it, holding a beer that he wasn't drinking. Dad, I said, settling onto the couch near his chair, can I ask you something about Mom's will? He muted the television and looked at me with tired eyes. What about it? Did you know that she had changed it so dramatically? The version she described to Jenny and me earlier was much more balanced. This new one leaves me with almost nothing. Dad's expression didn't change, but I noticed him grip his beer bottle a little tighter. Your mother made her own decisions about these things. She didn't always discuss them with me in detail. But you had to know about it, right? You're married. Don't you usually make these decisions together? Usually, he said carefully. But your mother had some strong feelings about how she wanted things handled. There was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't telling me everything he knew. Dad had never been a good liar, and the way he was avoiding eye contact reminded me of how he used to act when Mom asked him whether he had remembered to do some household task that he had forgotten. Strong feelings about what, specifically? Dad sighed and took a sip of his beer, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of our conversation. Sarah, your mother loved both you girls equally. But she worried about different things for each of you. She thought Jenny needed more help getting established, and she thought you were strong enough to make your own way. That's what she told me, I said. But there was something else, wasn't there? Something that made her really desperate for me to accept the inheritance arrangement without fighting it. Dad was quiet for so long that I thought he might not answer at all. Finally, he looked directly at me for the first time during our conversation. Your mother carried a lot of guilt about things that happened years ago, he said slowly. Things she thought might come to light after she died. She was worried that if you started asking questions or poking around in her affairs, you might find out things that would hurt the family. What kind of things? I don't know all the details, Dad said, though something in his expression suggested he knew more than he was willing to admit. Your mother kept some parts of her life private, even from me, but I know she made some decisions when you girls were younger that she always regretted. What decisions? Dad finished his beer and stood up, clearly signaling that the conversation was over. I think it's better to let sleeping dogs lie, Sarah. Your mother is gone, and digging up old problems isn't going to bring her back or change anything that matters now. But his words had the opposite effect from what he intended. Instead of discouraging my curiosity, they intensified it. Mom had been worried about me discovering something. Dad knew what that something was, but he was afraid to tell me. There were secrets in our family history that both of my parents had worked to keep hidden, and Mom's desperate final words had been an attempt to prevent me from uncovering them. The next morning, I called Mr. Chen's office and asked if I could schedule a private meeting to discuss some questions about the estate. His secretary arranged for me to come in that afternoon, and I spent the morning trying to prepare for a conversation I wasn't sure how to approach. Mr. Chen greeted me with the same professional warmth he had shown during our family meeting, but I could see curiosity in his eyes about why I wanted to speak with him alone. What can I help you with, Sarah? I have some questions about my mother's will, I began. Specifically about the timing and circumstances of the changes she made. Mr. Chen nodded and pulled Mom's file from his desk drawer. As I mentioned during our meeting with your family, the current will was executed 6 months ago, shortly after your mother's diagnosis. But she had a previous will, right? One that was different? Yes, there was an earlier version from about 5 years ago. The changes she made were quite substantial. Can you tell me what the earlier version said? Mr. Chen hesitated, clearly weighing his professional obligations against his personal relationship with our family. I'm not sure it's appropriate for me to discuss the details of superseded documents. Mr. Chen, my mother was terrified that I might contest this will. She made me promise multiple times that I wouldn't fight it. But I can't understand why she was so worried unless there's something about the situation that I don't know. He studied my face for a moment, apparently trying to assess my motivations. What exactly are you asking me, Sarah? I'm asking whether there was something unusual about the way she handled this inheritance. Something that might explain why she was so desperate for my acceptance. Mr. Chen was quiet for a long moment, tapping his pen against Mom's file. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. The earlier will divided your parents' assets much more evenly between you and Jennifer, he said. You would have inherited the house, while Jennifer would have received equivalent value in investments and savings. It was a fair and balanced arrangement. What made her change it so dramatically? She said she had realized that Jennifer's business ventures and lifestyle required more financial support, while your career in nursing provided more stability. But he paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue. But what? But the way she approached the changes was unusual. She seemed extremely anxious about the process, more so than most clients who are updating their estate plans. She asked me repeatedly about the legal requirements for challenging a will, about what kinds of evidence might be used to contest her decisions. This information sent a chill down my spine. Mom hadn't just been worried about family conflict over the inheritance. She had been specifically concerned about legal challenges, about evidence that might be used against her wishes. That suggested she knew there was something in her past or in her affairs that could potentially overturn her decisions if it came to light. Did she give you any indication of what she was worried about? Not directly, Mr. Chen said, but she did ask me to make sure that all of her personal papers were thoroughly reviewed as part of the estate settlement process. She wanted to ensure that nothing important was overlooked or missed. You mean like documents that might be relevant to the inheritance? I mean like any documents that might affect the estate in any way. She was very insistent that I conduct a complete review of all her personal papers, not just the obvious financial and legal documents. I left Mr. Chen's office with more questions than answers, but also with a clearer sense of direction. Mom had been hiding something significant enough to make her restructure her entire estate plan, and desperate enough to extract deathbed promises from me about not fighting her decisions. Whatever she had been hiding was likely to be found among her personal papers, the same papers that she had insisted Mr. Chen review thoroughly as part of the estate settlement. That evening, I returned to the house on Maple Street with a new purpose. Dad was working late at the garage, and Jenny was having dinner with some old high school friends who still lived in Riverside. I had the house to myself, and a growing determination to understand what Mom had been so afraid of me discovering. I started in the obvious places. Mom's desk in the kitchen, where she had paid bills and handled household correspondence. The drawers were neatly organized, filled with the usual collection of utility bills, bank statements, and family photos. Nothing seemed unusual or secretive, just the ordinary paperwork of a woman who had managed her household efficiently for decades. Next, I moved to the bedroom, searching through Mom's dresser drawers and the small jewelry box where she had kept her few pieces of valuable jewelry. Again, I found nothing that seemed significant. Old birthday cards from Jenny and me, a few letters from college friends, some newspaper clippings about former students who had achieved success in their adult lives. It was only when I entered Mom's craft room that I began to find things that didn't fit the pattern of ordinary household documents. The room was exactly as she had left it, with half-finished quilting projects spread across tables and boxes of supplies organized with the same meticulous care she had brought to every aspect of her life. But as I looked more carefully, I noticed that some of the storage boxes were labeled in ways that seemed unusual for craft supplies. One box, tucked away in the corner behind a stack of fabric, was labeled Important Papers Private, in Mom's distinctive handwriting. Inside this box, I found documents that immediately caught my attention. There were bank statements from accounts I didn't recognize, investment records for assets that hadn't been mentioned in the will, and correspondence with lawyers and financial advisors whose names I had never heard Mom mention. As I spread these documents across Mom's work table, a picture began to emerge that was completely different from what I had believed about my family's financial situation. The bank statements showed regular deposits of substantial amounts of money over a period of several years. The investment records indicated assets worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The legal correspondence discussed trust funds, tax shelters, and estate planning strategies that suggested a level of wealth far beyond what I had ever imagined my parents possessed. But most intriguing of all was a series of letters from a law firm in San Francisco, addressing Mom by her maiden name and discussing what appeared to be an ongoing legal settlement related to something called the Margaret Collins estate matter. The letters referenced quarterly payments, confidentiality agreements, and legal obligations that would continue until certain conditions were met. Margaret Collins. That was Mom's maiden name, the name she had used before marrying Dad. But why would a law firm be sending her correspondence about an estate matter involving her own maiden name? And why had she never mentioned receiving substantial quarterly payments from some kind of legal settlement? I sat in Mom's craft room until nearly midnight, reading through documents and trying to piece together the fragments of information I was discovering. By the time I finally went home to my apartment, I had a growing suspicion that my family's financial situation was far more complicated than any of us had realized, and that Mom's desperate concern about me contesting the will was connected to secrets that went much deeper than simple favoritism or unfair inheritance decisions. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in over a year. I needed time to process what I had discovered and to figure out my next steps. The documents I had found raised far more questions than they answered, but they clearly indicated that Mom had been involved in some kind of legal and financial situation that she had kept completely hidden from her family. Part 7. Beginning the investigation. The decision to investigate my mother's hidden financial affairs didn't come easily. Everything I had been taught about family loyalty and respecting the dead argued against digging deeper into secrets that Mom had clearly wanted to keep buried. But the nurse in me, trained to look for symptoms and underlying causes, couldn't ignore the evidence that something significant had been concealed from our family for years. I started by trying to understand the basic facts about the documents I had found. The bank statements showed an account at Wells Fargo that had been receiving deposits of $8,500 every 3 months for the past 7 years. The total amount deposited over that period was well over $200,000, money that had apparently been accumulating without any of us knowing about it. The investment records were even more intriguing. They showed a portfolio managed by a firm called Patterson Wealth Management, with assets totaling nearly $400,000 as of Mom's death. The investments included stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, but also something called a structured settlement annuity that I didn't understand. Most puzzling were the legal documents from Morrison, Blake, and Associates in San Francisco. The letters were formal and somewhat cryptic, referring to, quote, ongoing obligations under the Collins Settlement Agreement, and required quarterly distributions pursuant to court order dated March 15, 2016. They mentioned confidentiality provisions that prohibited Mom from discussing the settlement with anyone, and they warned that violation of these provisions could result in termination of payments and potential legal action. I spent my sick day researching everything I could find online about structured settlements, legal annuities, and estate matters. What I learned was that structured settlements are typically used to resolve personal injury lawsuits, providing regular payments to injured parties over a period of years rather than a single lump sum. But I couldn't imagine what kind of personal injury case Mom might have been involved in, or why she would have kept such a thing secret from her family. The confidentiality aspect was particularly troubling. Legal settlements often include non-disclosure agreements, but the tone of the letters from Morrison, Blake, and Associates suggested that the secrecy requirements were unusually strict. They repeatedly emphasized Mom's obligation to maintain complete confidentiality about the settlement, even after the payments ended, and they warned that any breach of confidentiality could have serious legal and financial consequences. By the end of the day, I had more questions than ever, but I also had a clearer sense of what I needed to do next. I needed to contact Morrison, Blake, and Associates directly and find out what kind of settlement Mom had been receiving payments from. I needed to understand why she had been required to keep it secret, and I needed to know whether this hidden wealth was connected to her dramatic revision of the family inheritance. The next morning, I called the law firm in San Francisco. The receptionist who answered was polite but cautious when I explained that I was calling about my deceased mother's settlement agreement. "I'll need to transfer you to Mr. Morrison," she said. "He handled all matters related to the Collins settlement." James Morrison had a deep, authoritative voice that immediately conveyed both competence and wariness. "Ms. Mitchell, I was expecting your call. Your mother's death has been reported to our office, and we need to discuss the implications for the settlement agreement." "Mr. Morrison, I have to be honest with you. I just discovered these documents in my mother's papers, and I don't understand what this settlement is about. My family had no idea that Mom was receiving these payments." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I see. That's unusual, but not unprecedented. Your mother was very concerned about maintaining confidentiality regarding this matter. Can you tell me what the settlement was for?" "I'm afraid that's complicated," Mr. Morrison said carefully. "The settlement agreement includes specific provisions about disclosure of information, even to family members. However, given that your mother has passed away, there may be some flexibility in how we handle these restrictions." "Mr. Morrison, I found documents showing that my mother received over $200,000 from this settlement over the past 7 years. She recently changed her will in ways that seem connected to this hidden money. I think I have a right to understand what's going on." Another long pause. "Ms. Mitchell, would it be possible for you to come to San Francisco for a meeting? This is the kind of conversation that should be handled in person, and there are documents that you should review before we proceed with settling your mother's obligations under the agreement." "What kind of obligations?" "The settlement agreement included certain requirements that extended beyond your mother's lifetime. Now that she has passed away, we need to determine how those obligations will be fulfilled." I scheduled a meeting with Mr. Morrison for the following Friday, taking another day off work and arranging to fly to San Francisco. The cost of the trip would strain my budget, but I knew I couldn't make informed decisions about my family's situation without understanding the full scope of what Mom had been hiding. Before leaving for San Francisco, I decided to have another conversation with Dad. The documents I had found suggested financial resources that should have affected our family's standard of living, but our household had always operated as if we were living on just Dad's mechanic salary and Mom's teacher's pension. Either Dad knew about the settlement money and had helped conceal it, or Mom had been hiding a substantial income from her own husband for years. I found Dad in the garage behind the house, working on his own truck's transmission. He looked up when I entered, wiping his hands on a shop rag with the careful attention of someone who was glad for the distraction. "Dad, I need to ask you about something I found in Mom's papers." His hands stilled on the rag, and I saw wariness creep into his expression. "What kind of something?" "Bank statements and legal documents showing that Mom had been receiving substantial payments from some kind of settlement agreement." "Did you know about this?" Dad set down the rag and leaned against his workbench, looking older than I had ever seen him. "I knew there was money coming in that she didn't want to talk about." "You knew? For how long?" "For a few years. She told me it was related to some legal matter from before we were married, something that had finally been resolved. She said it was complicated and that she was required to keep it confidential." "And you never asked for details?" Dad's laugh was bitter. "Your mother could be very determined when she wanted to keep something private. I learned early in our marriage that some battles weren't worth fighting. But Dad, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, money that could have changed our standard of living, could have helped with college expenses, could have made life easier for all of us." "I know," he said quietly, "but your mother had her reasons for handling things the way she did. She always said the money came with too many strings attached, that it was better to live as if we didn't have it." "What kind of strings?" "I don't know, Sarah. She wouldn't tell me, and I stopped asking after a while." "Did you know she was using this money to change her inheritance plans? The will she wrote cut me out almost entirely, but she had access to assets that weren't mentioned in the official estate documents." Dad's face went pale. "She wouldn't have done that. Your mother loved both you girls equally." "Then help me understand what's going on," I said. "I'm flying to San Francisco on Friday to meet with the lawyers who handled this settlement. If you know anything else about this situation, anything at all, I need you to tell me now." Dad was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands as if they held answers to questions he had been avoiding for years. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that held a pain I had never seen before. "There was something that happened before you girls were born," he said slowly. "Something involving your mother's first marriage." "First marriage?" I stared at him in shock. "Mom was married before you?" "Briefly, when she was very young, just out of college. She never talked about it. Said it was a mistake that she wanted to forget. But a few years ago, when the settlement payments started, she mentioned that it was connected to that time in her life." "Why didn't she ever tell us she had been married before?" "Because it ended badly, and because she was ashamed of the choices she had made during that period of her life. She said there were things she had done that she didn't want you girls to ever know about." The revelation that Mom had been married before Dad completely reframed everything I thought I knew about my family history. But it also raised new questions about what could have happened during that first marriage that would result in confidential settlement payments decades later. "Do you know the name of her first husband?" "Collins," Dad said. "Robert Collins. But Sarah, I think you should be very careful about digging into this. Your mother spent years trying to put that part of her life behind her. If she wanted it to stay buried, maybe there's a good reason for that." But I was already too deep into the mystery to turn back now. Mom's desperate final words, the hidden bank accounts, the confidential legal settlement, the revelation about her first marriage, all of these pieces were part of a larger puzzle that I was determined to understand. "I have to know, Dad. Mom restructured her entire inheritance around this secret. She cut me out of the will because of something connected to this settlement. I can't just pretend none of this exists." Dad nodded slowly, looking resigned. "Then be careful, Sarah. And remember that sometimes the truth is more complicated and more painful than the lies we tell ourselves to feel better." As I prepared for my trip to San Francisco, I found myself thinking about everything I had learned about truth and family secrets during my years as a nurse. In healthcare, hidden information almost always makes problems worse. Patients who don't tell their doctors about their symptoms, families who don't share relevant medical history, people who avoid seeking treatment because they're afraid of what they might learn. All of these situations lead to delayed diagnoses, missed opportunities for treatment, and unnecessary suffering. I suspected that my family's secrets were like undiagnosed symptoms, problems that had been festering beneath the surface for years, while we all pretended everything was normal. Mom's desperate final words, and her drastic revision of the inheritance, were symptoms of something deeper, something that had been affecting our family dynamics in ways we hadn't understood. The flight to San Francisco gave me time to prepare for what I might learn from Mr. Morrison. I had brought copies of all the documents I had found, along with a list of questions about the settlement, the confidentiality requirements, and the ongoing obligations that Mom's death had apparently triggered. But as the plane descended towards San Francisco International Airport, I realized that I was also preparing for the possibility that what I learned might fundamentally change how I understood my mother, my family, and my own place in the complicated story that was about to unfold. Part 8. Deeper Discovery. The offices of Morrison, Blake & Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming high-rise in downtown San Francisco, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered spectacular views of the Bay Bridge and Alcatraz Island. The reception area was decorated with expensive artwork and fresh flowers, the kind of understated luxury that suggested clients who could afford premium legal services. James Morrison met me in the reception area personally, a courtesy that immediately told me this was not going to be a routine consultation. He was a man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that comes from years of handling complex legal matters. His handshake was firm, his smile professionally warm, but I could see calculation in his eyes as he assessed me. "Ms. Mitchell, thank you for making the trip up here. I know this situation must be very confusing for you." He led me to a conference room that was even more impressive than the reception area, with a polished mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs and walls lined with legal volumes that looked both expensive and well-used. On the table was a thick file folder with my mother's maiden name typed on the label, Collins, Margaret Ellen, Settlement Agreement and Related Matters. "Before we begin," Mr. Morrison said as we settled into chairs across from each other, "I need to confirm your identity and your relationship to Margaret Collins Mitchell." He pulled out a form and asked me to provide identification, which he photocopied and attached to documents in his file. "Now then," he he continued. As I mentioned on the phone, your mother's death has created some complications regarding her settlement agreement. The terms of the settlement included specific provisions about confidentiality and ongoing obligations that don't automatically terminate upon death. Mr. Morrison, I still don't understand what this settlement was for. My family had no idea that Mom was receiving these payments, and I've only recently discovered that she had a first marriage that ended before I was born. Mr. Morrison nodded gravely. Your mother was very committed to maintaining confidentiality about this matter. The settlement agreement included unusually strict non-disclosure provisions, and she honored them completely for more than 20 years. 20 years? This has been going on for 20 years? The original incident that led to the settlement occurred in 1998, Mr. Morrison said, consulting the file. But the legal proceedings took several years to resolve, and the settlement agreement wasn't finalized until 2001. Your mother has been receiving quarterly payments since then. What incident? What happened in 1998? Mr. Morrison was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. Ms. Mitchell, what I'm about to tell you may be difficult to hear. Your mother was involved in a situation that resulted in serious harm to another person, and the settlement was designed to provide ongoing compensation for that harm. I felt my heart begin to race. What kind of harm? Was Mom in an accident? Not exactly an accident, Mr. Morrison said. The situation was more complex than that. Your mother was married at the time to Robert Collins, a wealthy businessman who owned several successful restaurants in the Bay Area. The marriage was troubled, and your mother had begun proceedings for divorce. What does that have to do with harming someone? During the divorce proceedings, your mother became involved with another man, a relationship that Mr. Collins discovered. There was a confrontation between your mother, her boyfriend, and Mr. Collins that resulted in Mr. Collins suffering severe injuries that left him permanently disabled. The room seemed to tilt around me. Mom was involved in something that permanently disabled someone? The exact circumstances were disputed, Mr. Morrison said carefully. Your mother maintained that she acted in self-defense during a violent altercation. Mr. Collins claimed that the attack was unprovoked and premeditated. The case never went to trial, but it was clear that litigation would be lengthy, expensive, and damaging to all parties involved. So they settled? They settled. Mr. Collins agreed not to pursue criminal charges, and your mother agreed to make regular payments to cover his ongoing medical expenses and compensate him for his lost earning capacity. The settlement was structured to provide him with quarterly payments for the rest of his life, with the payments continuing to his estate if he predeceased your mother. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. My mother, the elementary school teacher who had dedicated her life to helping children, had been involved in something that left a man permanently disabled. The woman who had raised me to believe in honesty, compassion, and taking responsibility for your actions had been living with this secret for more than 2 decades. Mr. Morrison, if this happened in 1998, I would have been about 6 years old. Ginny would have been 9. Why don't we have any memory of Mom being involved in legal troubles? Because your mother was very careful to keep her past life completely separate from her life with your father and you children. She moved to Riverside immediately after the settlement was finalized, changed her name when she married your father, and never spoke about her previous marriage or the legal proceedings that followed. But the payments continued all these years? Yes. The settlement agreement required her to make quarterly payments of $8,500, adjusted annually for inflation. Over the past 22 years, she has paid well over $500,000 to Mr. Collins. $500,000. The amount was staggering, but it also explained so much about our family's financial limitations during my childhood. We hadn't been poor, but we had lived carefully, always conscious of expenses, always making choices based on what we could afford, rather than what we wanted. Now I understood why. A significant portion of Mom's income had been going to these secret settlement payments. Is Mr. Collins still alive? He died 18 months ago, Mr. Morrison said, which is why your mother's death has created complications. The settlement agreement included provisions for what would happen if either party died first. What kind of provisions? Mr. Morrison pulled out a thick legal document and turned to a section that had been highlighted in yellow. According to the terms of the settlement, If Mr. Collins died first, your mother's payment obligations would continue to his estate for a period of 5 years. If your mother died first, her estate would be responsible for making a final lump sum payment equivalent to 5 years of quarterly payments. I calculated quickly in my head. 5 years of quarterly payments at $8,500 each would be, you're talking about $170,000? Actually, with the inflation adjustments over the years, the current quarterly payment is $11,200. So the lump sum payment would be $224,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. Mom's estate owed $224,000 to the estate of the man she had disabled decades before I was born. This was why she had been so desperate for me to accept the inheritance arrangement without question. This was why she had restructured the will to give Jenny everything. She knew that a substantial portion of the estate would have to go to fulfilling this final obligation. Does my sister know about this? Not unless your mother told her, which seems unlikely given her commitment to confidentiality. And my father? The settlement agreement specifically prohibited your mother from disclosing details of the arrangement to anyone, including family members. If she told your father anything, it would have been a violation of the terms. I thought about my conversation with Dad, about his knowledge that money was coming in but his lack of information about where it came from or why it was confidential. Mom had managed to live with this secret for over 20 years, making the payments while building a new life and raising 2 daughters who never suspected that their childhood financial limitations were connected to their mother's hidden past. Mr. Morrison, what happens now? Is Jenny's inheritance going to be reduced by this $224,000 payment? That depends on how your mother structured her estate planning. If she set aside sufficient assets to cover this obligation, then the rest of her estate can be distributed according to her will. If she didn't, then yes, the inheritance will be reduced by the amount owed. And if we can't pay it, then the estate of Robert Collins has the right to pursue legal action to recover the funds, which could result in forced sale of assets, garnishment of other estate funds, or other collection actions. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together. Mom's desperate concern about me contesting the will wasn't just about family harmony or her feelings about which daughter deserved what. It was about protecting a secret that could destroy our family's reputation and potentially leave us all financially devastated if the truth came to light during contentious legal proceedings. Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you something directly. Did my mother set aside money to cover this final payment? He consulted the file again, pulling out what appeared to be financial statements and correspondence with investment advisors. Your mother was very diligent about preparing for this eventuality. She established a separate investment account specifically to accumulate funds for the final settlement payment. Based on our records, this account should contain sufficient funds to cover the obligation. Should contain? The account was managed by Patterson Wealth Management, and our most recent statement shows a balance of approximately $280,000. However, we'll need to verify the current balance and ensure that the funds are readily accessible for transfer to the Collins estate. I felt a surge of relief, followed immediately by a wave of new questions. So the inheritance Ginny and I are supposed to receive, that's separate from this settlement money? According to your mother's estate planning documents, yes. She was very careful to keep her settlement obligations separate from her family inheritance plans. But even as Mr. Morrison explained the financial arrangements, I was grappling with the larger implications of what I had learned. My mother had been living a double life for more than 20 years, making secret payments to compensate a man she had seriously injured, while presenting herself to her family and community as a devoted teacher and mother. The woman who had raised me to believe in honesty and taking responsibility for your actions had built her entire adult life around concealing the consequences of something terrible that had happened in her youth. The financial sacrifices our family had made throughout my childhood, the careful budgeting and modest lifestyle that I had attributed to middle-class prudence, had actually been the result of Mom's obligation to pay for harm she had caused to another person. Mr. Morrison, can you tell me anything else about what actually happened between my mother and Mr. Collins? You said the circumstances were disputed. I'm afraid the specific details of the incident are covered by the confidentiality provisions of the settlement agreement. What I can tell you is that both parties had compelling legal arguments, and both parties had significant vulnerabilities if the case had gone to trial. But someone was seriously injured. Someone's life was permanently changed. Yes, Mr. Morrison said gravely. And your mother took financial responsibility for that injury, even though she maintained that her actions were justified under the circumstances. As our meeting concluded, Mr. Morrison provided me with copies of the relevant legal documents and contact information for Patterson Wealth Management, so I could verify the status of the settlement fund that Mom had established. He also gave me the contact information for the attorney representing the Collins estate, so arrangements could be made for the final payment. Ms. Mitchell, he said as we shook hands in the reception area, I want you to know that your mother handled this situation with dignity and responsibility. She never missed a payment. She never violated the confidentiality provisions, and she prepared carefully for this final obligation. Whatever happened in 1998, she spent the rest of her life making amends for it. The flight back to Riverside felt endless, giving me too much time to process the devastating revelations about my mother's past. Every few minutes, I would remember another detail from Mr. Morrison's explanation and feel a fresh wave of shock and confusion. The woman who had raised me, who had taught me the importance of honesty and compassion, had been living with the knowledge that she had permanently disabled someone. The financial struggles I had attributed to ordinary middle-class economics had actually been the result of her ongoing obligation to pay for harm she had caused. By the time I landed at Ontario International Airport, I had moved beyond the initial shock and begun grappling with more practical questions. How was I going to tell Jenny about what I had discovered? How would Dad react to learning that I knew the truth about Mom's first marriage and the settlement payments? Most importantly, how was this information going to affect our family's relationships and our ability to move forward after Mom's death? I had always prided myself on being straightforward and honest in my relationships, values that I thought I had learned from my parents. Now I was discovering that my entire childhood had been built on a foundation of secrets and carefully managed deceptions. Mom had been making quarterly payments of thousands of dollars while we lived modestly, saving money on groceries and driving used cars. She had structured her inheritance plans around obligations that none of us knew existed, cutting me out of the will not because she loved me less, but because she was trying to protect a secret that could have destroyed our family's reputation and financial security. The drive from the airport to Riverside gave me additional time to consider my options. I could keep this information to myself, honoring the confidentiality that had been so important to Mom for more than 20 years. The settlement account that she had established contained enough money to fulfill her final obligation to the Collins estate, which meant Jenny's inheritance wouldn't be affected by the debt. I could let Mr. Chen handle the financial arrangements quietly, and my family could move forward without ever knowing about Mom's hidden past. But the nurse in me, trained to believe that hidden information usually makes problems worse, couldn't accept that approach. Jenny deserved to understand why the inheritance had been structured so unfairly. Dad deserved to know the full truth about the woman he had been married to for nearly 4 decades. And I deserved answers about why my entire childhood had been shaped by the financial consequences of something that had happened before I was born. More than that, I was beginning to understand that Mom's desperate final words hadn't been about the inheritance at all. They had been about protecting her secret, about ensuring that her death didn't trigger the kind of family conflict that might lead to legal challenges and public scrutiny of her affairs. She had been terrified that if I contested the will, the resulting investigation might uncover information about the settlement payments and expose the truth about her past. When I arrived at my apartment that evening, I found a voicemail from Jenny asking me to call her when I got back from San Francisco. Her voice sounded strained, and I wondered if she had discovered something in Mom's papers that had raised questions about our family's finances. I called her back immediately, and she answered on the first ring. Sarah, thank God you're back. I've been going through more of Mom's things, and I found some documents that don't make sense. There are bank statements for accounts I've never heard of, and investment records that show way more money than we thought Mom and Dad had. Where are you now? I'm at the house with Dad. We've been trying to figure out what these papers mean, but some of them are addressed to Mom using her maiden name, and there are references to legal settlements that we don't understand. I'll be right over. The 20-minute drive to Maple Street felt like the longest journey of my life. I was about to tell my family truths that would fundamentally change how they understood their wife and mother, truths that might destroy their memories of the woman they had loved and mourned. But I was also about to provide answers to questions that had been troubling all of us since Mom's death, explanations for her desperate final words, and her inexplicable revision of the family inheritance. I found Jenny and Dad sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by the documents that I had discovered in Mom's craft room, along with additional papers that Jenny had apparently found in other locations throughout the house. They both looked up when I entered, their faces reflecting the same confusion and concern that I had been feeling for the past week. "Sarah, what did you find out in San Francisco?" Jenny asked immediately. "These documents suggest that Mom was involved in some kind of legal matter that we never knew about." I sat down at the table, looking at the faces of the two people who mattered most to me in the world, and tried to find words for a conversation that I had been dreading since my meeting with Mr. Morrison. "What I found out is going to be very difficult to hear," I began, "and it's going to change how we think about Mom and about our family history." Dad's face was already pale, and I suspected he had a better idea than Jenny about what I might have discovered. "Just tell us, Sarah." So I told them everything. I explained about Mom's first marriage to Robert Collins, about the violent confrontation that had left him permanently disabled, about the settlement agreement that had required her to make quarterly payments for more than 20 years. I described the confidentiality provisions that had prevented her from discussing the situation with anyone, including her own family. I explained about the final lump sum payment that her estate was obligated to make, and about the separate investment account she had established to cover that debt. Jenny listened in stunned silence, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just staring at me as if I were describing events from someone else's life, rather than revelations about our own mother. Dad's reaction was more complex, a mixture of shock, sadness, and what looked like relief at finally understanding secrets that had affected his marriage for decades. "So the inheritance situation," Jenny said slowly, "Mom didn't cut you out because she thought I deserved more. She did it because she was trying to protect this secret." "That's what I think," I replied. "She was terrified that if I contested the will, the legal proceedings might uncover information about the settlement payments. She restructured everything to minimize the chance of family conflict that could lead to public scrutiny of her affairs." "And the money she's been paying all these years," Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's why we always had to be so careful about expenses, why there was never enough for extras." The quarterly payments were over $8,000, increasing with inflation. Over the past 22 years, she paid more than $500,000 to Mr. Collins. Jenny put her head in her hands. "I can't believe this. I can't believe Mom was living with this secret for my entire life." "It gets more complicated," I said. "Mr. Collins died 18 months ago, which means Mom's payment obligations should have ended. But the settlement agreement included a provision requiring a final lump sum payment if she died first." "How much?" Dad asked. $224,000. The number hung in the air between us, representing not just a financial obligation, but also the final chapter in Mom's decades-long attempt to make amends for something terrible that had happened in her youth. "But the good news," I continued, "is that Mom prepared for this. She had established a separate investment account specifically to cover this final payment. The account contains enough money to fulfill the obligation without affecting the rest of her estate." "So Jenny's inheritance won't be reduced?" Dad asked. "It shouldn't be, assuming the investment account has maintained its value." We sat in silence for several minutes, each of us processing the implications of what we had learned. Finally, Jenny looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Sarah, I'm so sorry about the inheritance situation. If I had known that Mom was structuring it this way because of some secret legal obligation, I never would have accepted it." "It's not your fault," I replied. "You didn't know any more than I did. But it's not fair. You're the one who stayed here, who took care of them, who was here every Sunday. You're the one who should inherit the house. Jenny, we can work out something fair between ourselves after everything is settled. That's not the important issue right now." Dad had been quiet during our exchange, but now he looked up at both of us with an expression I had never seen before. "There's something else you both need to know," he said. "Something your mother made me promise never to tell you, but I think you deserve to understand the whole truth." Jenny and I exchanged glances, wondering what additional revelation could possibly be more shocking than what we had already learned. "Your mother didn't just happen to meet me after her divorce from Robert Collins," Dad said. She sought me out specifically because she needed to create a new identity, a new life that was completely separate from her past. What do you mean? I asked. I mean that our entire relationship, our marriage, our family, was built around her need to hide from what had happened during her first marriage. She chose me because I was ordinary, because I lived in a small town where nobody would ask too many questions about her past, because I was the kind of man who could help her disappear into a normal middle-class life. The implications of what Dad was saying were staggering. Are you telling us that Mom married you as part of covering up her past? I'm telling you that she was very clear about what she needed from our relationship and what she couldn't give in return. She told me that she had made mistakes in her previous life that she could never discuss, and that our marriage would have to be built around accepting that limitation. Did you know about the settlement payments from the beginning? I knew that she had financial obligations from her past that she couldn't discuss. I knew that a significant portion of her income was committed to things she couldn't explain. But I didn't know the details until the payments actually started, and even then she only told me enough to explain why money was leaving our accounts every quarter. Jenny was crying openly now. So our entire family was built on lies? Not lies, Dad said gently. Secrets. There's a difference. Your mother loved us, all of us, genuinely and completely. But she also knew that her love came with obligations and limitations that she couldn't explain without breaking legal agreements and potentially destroying the life she had built. I found myself thinking about the conversations I had had with Mom over the years, the way she had always seemed to hold something back, the way she had been more comfortable with surface-level pleasantries than with deep emotional intimacy. I had attributed her reserve to personality or generational differences, but now I understood that it had been a protective mechanism, a way of preventing accidentally revealing information that could have catastrophic consequences for our family. The question now, I said, is what we do with this information. Do we fulfill Mom's final obligation quietly and move on, or do we try to learn more about what actually happened in 1998? What more is there to learn? Jenny asked. Mom was involved in something that seriously injured someone. She took financial responsibility for it, and she spent the rest of her life making amends. But we don't know the circumstances, I replied. Mr. Morrison said that Mom maintained she acted in self-defense, that the situation was more complex than it appeared. Dad was shaking his head. Sarah, your mother spent over 20 years trying to put that part of her life behind her. If she wanted us to know more about what happened, she would have told us. But maybe she couldn't tell us because of the confidentiality agreement. Maybe now that she's gone, we can finally understand what really happened and why she was so determined to keep it secret. The conversation continued late into the evening, with each of us processing the revelations differently and reaching different conclusions about how to move forward. Jenny was focused on the practical implications for the inheritance and our family's financial future. Dad was more concerned about honoring Mom's wishes and avoiding any actions that might dishonor her memory. I was struggling with my need to understand the complete truth about the woman who had raised me. By the time we finally ended our discussion, we had reached a tentative agreement about next steps. I would contact Patterson Wealth Management to verify the balance in Mom's settlement account and arrange for the final payment to the Collins estate. Jenny would work with Mr. Chen to finalize the probate process and ensure that the settlement obligation was handled properly. Dad would decide whether he wanted to continue living in the house or make other arrangements for his future. But we also agreed that each of us needed time to process what we had learned before making any decisions about whether to investigate Mom's past further. The revelations had been overwhelming, and we all needed space to grieve not just Mom's death, but also the loss of our assumptions about who she had been and what our family history actually encompassed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.